The morning wind carried more than dust across the New Mexico territory. That September of 1882, Jake Morrison could feel something different in the air as he guided his weathered horse through the canyon pass, the leather of his saddle creaking with each step. What he didn't know was that by nightfall, his simple act of kindness would either save his life or seal his fate when 200 Apache warriors would surround his camp. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, chasing rumors of work at the copper mines near Silver City, when he heard the sound that would change everything. It wasn't the usual desert silence he'd grown accustomed during his years as a drifter. This was a low, rhythmic chanting carried on the wind, followed by what sounded like someone in considerable pain. Against his better judgment, Jake dismounted and tied his horse to a scraggly mesquite bush. The smart thing would have been to keep riding his own business and reach the mining town before sunset, but Jake Morrison had never been particular at doing this. Following the sound through a narrow gap between two red rock formations, Jake found himself looking down into below near a trickling stream. He saw an elderly Apache man sitting alone, his weathered face etched. The old man's left leg clearly injured, and beside him lay a crude walking stick that had snapped. Most white men in 1882 would have backed away quietly and continued on their journey. The Apache Wars had been raging for decades, and trust between the two peoples was rarer than water in August. But Jake saw something in the old man's dignified bearing that reminded him of his own grandfather, who had raised him after his parents passed from fever when he was making no sudden movement. Jake slowly descended into the valley, his hands clearly visible and empty. The old Apache looked up without surprise, as if he had been expecting this strange visitor all along. "I'm not here to cause trouble," stopping respectful distance away. "Looks like you could use some help." The old man studied him with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through to Jake's soul. When he finally spoke, his English was careful but clear. "You are far from your people, same as you, I reckon. Name's Jake Morrison. What happened to your leg?" "I am called Standing Bear." The old gesture was injured limb, a loose stone. "The years have made my footing less certain than it once was." Jake could see that Standing Bear's ankle badly swollen, possibly broken. The improvised walking beside him was clearly inadequate for supporting his weight over the rough terrain. "I've got some supplies that might help, and I'm handy with woodwork. My grandfather taught me to carve when I was knee-high to a grasshopper." For a long moment Standing Bear said nothing. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Jake spent the rest of the afternoon working in the shade of a large boulder. From his saddlebags he pulled out a small collection of tools that he carried for maintaining his gear. But more importantly, he found a sturdy piece of oak that he'd been saving to repair his rifle stock. As he carefully shaped and carved the wood, Jake found himself telling Standing Bear about his grandfather, about learning to whittle by lamplight in their small cabin in Missouri. Standing Bear, in turn, shared stories of his own youth, of learning the old ways from his father. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," Standing Bear said as Jake tested the fit of the crutch against the old man's shoulder. "He was. Always said that being decent to folks costs nothing but pays dividends." Jake made a final adjustment to the padding he'd fashioned from strips of leather. "Try this now." Standing Bear carefully levered himself up using the new crutch. The craftsmanship was excellent. The height was perfect, the padding comfortable, and the wood strong enough to bear his weight reliably. "This is fine work," Standing Bear said, taking a few careful steps. "You have honored the memory of your grandfather." As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls shades of orange, Jake prepared to touch. Standing Bear held up a "Wait, there's something you must know." The old man's expression had grown serious. "You have shown kindness to one who had little reason to expect it. Tomorrow, the sun rises, you may face a test that will require more than—" Jake felt a chill despite the warm evening. "What kind of test?" Standing Bear looked toward the canyon entrance. "My grandson leads a war party. They have been tracking a group of miners who destroyed a sacred spring and took lives that should not have been taken. The trail led them here." The pieces began falling into place in Jake's mind. The mining operation he'd been heading toward, the tension he'd sensed in the nearby settlements, the unusual quiet of the desert. "Your grandson's coming here?" "At dawn, with 200 warriors." Standing Bear met Jake's eyes. "When they find me with a white man, there will be questions. Difficult questions." Jake's mouth went dry. He'd heard stories of what happened to white men caught in Apache territory during wartime. Most of those stories didn't end well. "I should go," Jake said, moving toward his horse. "Running now would be worse," Standing Bear said quietly. "They are already watching the canyon entrance. Your only chance is to stay and trust that one act of kindness might balance against years of hatred." That night, Jake built a small, smokeless fire and sat across from Standing Bear as the old man shared his history. Standing Bear had been a warrior in his youth, had fought in some of the fiercest battles of the Apache, but he had also been a voice for peace in his tribe, advocating for finding ways to coexist with the white settlement. "My grandson sees only the destruction, the broken treaties, the murdered families," Standing Bear. "He believes the only answer is to drive all white men from our lands. He may not be wrong, but his path leads only to more death." As the night wore on, Jake learned that Standing Bear's grandson was Warhawk, a name that struck fear into the hearts of miners and settlers throughout the territory. Warhawk was known for his tactical brilliance and his complete ruthlessness toward enemies. "What's his relationship with you like?" Jake asked. Standing Bear was quiet for a long time. "We have not spoken in 3 years. He believes I have grown soft, that I have forgotten the old ways. When he sees me accepting help from a white man..." The old man trailed off. Dawn came too quickly. Jake woke to the sound of his horse whinnying nervously. As he opened his eyes, he saw them. Silhouetted against the early morning light, Apache warriors lined the rim of the canyon. Silent as shadows, they had positioned themselves at every possible escape route. Jake counted quickly. Standing Bear hadn't been exaggerating. There had to be at least 200 of them, maybe more. They sat their horses with the patience of men who had all the time in the world. Standing Bear was already awake, sitting calmly beside the dead fire. "They have been there since before first light," he said without looking up. "My grandson is thorough." A single rider began descending into the canyon. Even from a distance, Jake could see this was a man who commanded absolute respect. Warhawk was younger than Jake had expected, perhaps 30 years old, but he carried himself with the authority of someone who had never lost a battle. Warhawk dismounted 20 feet away, his dark eyes moving between his grandfather and stranger. He spoke in rapid Apache, his voice filled with what sounded like angry question. Standing Bear replied calmly, his tone respectful but firm. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Warhawk's voice growing increasingly heated, while Standing Bear remained composed. Finally, Warhawk switched to English, his words directed at Jake. "My grandfather tells an interesting story, white man. He says you carved him a walking and shared your fire without asking for payment." Jake, keeping his hands. "It's true. He needed help." "Help?" Warhawk spat the... "Your people's idea of help is to take our land, pollute our water, and eliminate our families. Why should this be different?" "Because sometimes one person's just trying to do right by another person," Jake said simply. "Has nothing to do with being white or Apache, being human." Warhawk studied him with eyes that had seen too much death for someone human. An interesting word from someone whose people have shown us so little humanity. Standing Bear spoke again in Apache, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. Warhawk listened, but his expression remained hard. "My grandfather believes you are different," Warhawk said finally. "He believes your actions came from honor, not strategy. But words are easy, white man. Actions tell truth." Warhawk gestured, and several warriors rode down into the canyon. Jake felt his heart hammering as they approached, but they made no move to draw a weapon. "You will come with us," Warhawk announced. "There is something you must. Then we will know if your kindness is real or just another white man's lie." They rode for 2 hours through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without guide. Jake found himself surrounded by Apache warriors who moved through the landscape like they were. These were the savage raiders, the skilled fighters with a deep understanding of their home. Finally, they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley that made Jake's stomach turn. Below was what had once been a small Apache. The remains of wickiups dotted the area, but everything had been burned. The sacred spring that Standing Bear had mentioned was fouled with mining waste. Its clear waters turned a sickly yellow, but worse than the destruction was the evidence of violence. Jake could see where the mining company's hired guns had made their attack. The tactical positioning, the burned structures, the scattered belongings, all told a story of a massacre carried out with military precision. 15 families lived here, Warhawk's, his voice carefully controlled. Men, women, children, elders. The miners wanted this valley for its copper deposits. When my people refused to move, the The miners hired professional fighters to remove the problem. Jake stared at the scene feeling sick. He'd heard rumors of such, but seeing the evidence firsthand was different. How many survived? 3 children. They hid in the rocks when the shooting started. Warhawk's jaw was tight. They are the ones who brought word to our main camp. Standing Bear had ridden up beside them, leaning heavily on the crutch Jake had made. This is why my grandson's heart is filled with war thunder, he said quietly. This is why he believes all white men are enemies. Warhawk dismounted and walked to the edge of the destroyed settlement. The men who did this rode toward Silver City. We followed their trail here, the canyon where we found you with my grandfather. Jake felt the pieces clicking into place. You thought I might be one of them? The thought occurred to me. Warhawk turned back to face him. A white man, alone in Apache territory, carrying tools and weapons. It would have been convenient if you had been involved. Convenient how? Warhawk's smile was cold. Dead men cannot tell stories about Apache justice. The weight of how close Jake had come to a very unpleasant end settled on him like a heavy blanket. But something else was becoming clear as well. What do you plan to do about the men who actually did this? Jake asked. Find them. Stop them from doing this to anyone else. Warhawk's tone suggested that stop them was a significant understatement. Jake looked again at the destroyed settlement, then back at Warhawk. I was heading to Silver City to find work at the mines. Might be I could help you track these men down. The suggestion caused an immediate stir among the warriors, several of them to Warhawk. Their tones clearly indicate they thought Jake's incredibly brave. Warhawk studied. Why would you do this? These are not your people who were harmed. Jake thought about his grandfather, about the lessons in doing right that had been carved into his character as surely as he had carved Standing Bear's crutch. Because what happened here was wrong. Doesn't matter who did it or who it was done to. Some things are just wrong. Standing Bear smiled, the first real smile Jake had seen from. I told you he was different, grandson. Warhawk was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing options that could affect the lives of many people. Finally he spoke. The men we seek are dangerous. They are professional, hired by men with money and influence. They will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their interest. I understand. Do you? Warhawk stepped closer. Because once you ride with us, there will be no going back. Win or lose, you will be marked as someone who fought alongside the Apache. Your own people will consider you a traitor. Jake had been drifting for years, never staying in one place long enough to form real connections, never finding anything worth taking a stand for. But looking at Standing Bear sitting proud and dignified despite his injury, despite the destruction of his people's home, Jake realized he had found something worth the risk. I'm in, he said simply. Warhawk nodded slowly. Then we ride together. But understand this, Jake Morrison. If you betray us, if this is some elaborate trick, you will die more slowly than you can imagine. Fair enough. But if we're going to work together, I need to know your real plan. Charging into Silver City with 200 warriors is going to get a lot of people on both sides sent to their graves. Warhawk's expression suggested that sending people to their graves wasn't necessarily a bad outcome in his mind. But Standing Bear, my grandson is a great warrior, is still young. Perhaps wisdom and warfare can work together. Over the next several hours, they developed a plan that balanced Warhawk's need for justice with Jake's understanding of how white settlement. Jake would ride into Silver City openly, work at the mine, and identifying the men responsible for the massacre. Warhawk and a small group of his best warriors would position themselves in the hills outside town, ready to act when Jake gave them a signal. What about the rest of your men, Jake, gesturing toward the large war party? They will remain hidden but close, Warhawk. If this goes wrong, if you are captured, or if the miners try to harm my advance party, then Silver City will see what 200 Apache warriors can accomplish. It was a sobering reminder of just how much riding on their. The ride to Silver City took 2 days. Jake traveled alone for final approach, while Warhawk, 5 of his warriors, took positions in the hills overlooking the mining town. The plan was for Jake to spend several days learning the layout of the operation and identifying the hired guns responsible for the massacre. Silver City in 1882 was a rough place, even by frontier standards. The recent copper strikes had brought in miners, gamblers, merchants, and criminals. in roughly equal numbers. The main street was a mixture of legitimate businesses and establishments that operated on the shadier side of the law. Jake had no trouble finding work at the prospector's dream mine. The operation was larger than he'd expected, with dozens of workers extracting copper from the hillsides around town. More importantly, it was clear that the mine owners had money and weren't particular about how they protected their interests. On his second day, Jake met the men he'd been looking for. They were hard to miss. 5 professional gunfighters lounging around the Lucky Dollar Saloon, their expensive weapons and cocky attitudes marking them as the type of men who solved problems. They called themselves the Garrett Gang, after their leader, a tall man with cold eyes named Samuel Garrett. Jake spent the evening nursing a beer and listening to their conversation. What he heard made his blood run cold. They weren't just talking about the Apache settlement they destroyed. They were planning to hit another one the following week. "Boss wants the whole valley cleared out," Garrett says. "There's a vein of copper running right under where those families are camping." "How many this time?" One of his, a wiry man with a nervous eye. "Maybe 20, 25. Shouldn't be much trouble. Most of them are women and children." Jake forced himself to remain calm and keep listening. He learned that the mine owner, a man named Harrison Blake, had been systematically driving Apache families off their traditional lands to access mineral deposit. The massacre at Standing Bear Settlement had just been the most recent in a series of clearance operations. That night, Jake slipped out of town and made his way to Warhawk's position in the hills. The Apache warrior listened to his report in grim silence. 25 more people, Warhawk, including children. "We can stop them, but we need to move fast. They're planning to hit the settlement tomorrow night." Warhawk looked toward Silver City, its lights twinkling in the darkness. 5 gunfighters, plus however many miners and townspeople who might support them. "Actually, I think most of the townspeople don't know what's really happening. Blake's been telling everyone that the Apache attacks on miners, not the other way around. If we can expose the truth, you think the truth will matter to them?" Warhawk's voice carried years of bitter experience. "Maybe not to all of them. To some, enough to make a difference." They worked through the night, developing a new plan. Instead of simply stopping the Garrett Gang, they would expose Blake's operation and let the townspeople decide for themselves what kind of community they wanted to live in. The next evening, Jake was back in the Lucky Dollar Saloon when Garrett and his men began preparing for their mission. Jake had spent the day spreading carefully chosen rumors around town, planting seeds of doubt about Blake's version of recent events. As Garrett's men checked their weapons, Jake stood up and spoke loudly enough for the entire saloon to hear. "Mighty brave of you boys going after women and children." The saloon went quiet. Garrett turned slowly, his hand resting on his gun. "You got something to say, Drifter?" "Just wondering if the folks around here know what you're really getting paid for." His own hand to draw. "See, I was riding through Apache territory last week. Found some interesting things." "Like what?" Jake pulled out a piece of cloth he'd taken from the destroyed settlement. It was clearly from a child's dress, and it was stained with blood. "Like the fact that you boys aren't fighting warriors. You're executing families." Jake looked around the saloon at the miners and townspeople who had stopped their drinking to listen. "How many of you have actually seen these dangerous Apache raids Blake keeps talking about? How many of you have seen weapons or war paint or anything that looks like an attack?" Several men exchanged glances. Jake could see doubt beginning to form. Blake himself chose that moment to enter the sun, flanked by 2 of his security men. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, the soft of someone who had never done manual labor. "Garrett, what's the delay?" "You should have left an hour ago." "We've got a problem, Mr. Blake," Garrett said, nodding toward Jake. "This cowboy seems to know more than he should." Blake looked at Jake with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to solving problems through money or violence. "And who might you be?" "Just someone who's seen what your clearance operations really look like," Jake ripped. "Tell me, Mr. Blake, do the people of Silver City know you're paying men to eliminate families so you can steal their land?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Blake's face went through several expressions before settling on cold anger. "That's a serious charge, stranger. You'd better be prepared to back it up." "I am." Jake looked around the room again. "Anyone here want to ride out with me tomorrow and see Standing Bear's settlement? See what professional gunfighters do to children when there's copper in the ground?" "Standing Bear?" One of the miners spoke up. "The old Apache who used to trade in town? Someone hurt his people? Wiped them out. Every man, woman, and child they could find. Poisoned their water source. Burned their homes." Blake stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled rage. You're talking about criminals and savages. They were stealing from my mining operation. Were they? Jake pulled out another item from the destroyed settlement, a child's toy carved from wood. This looked like the handiwork of dangerous thieves to you? The saloon was completely silent. Even Garrett seemed uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Blake made a decision that would seal his fate. Garrett, I don't care what this man thinks he knows. You have a job to do. Actually, Jake said quietly, I don't think they do. That was the signal. Warhawk and his warriors had been positioned outside the saloon for the past hour, waiting for Jake's code word. They entered silently through the back door and side windows, moving like shadows until they were in position. The first person to notice them was one of Garrett's men, who looked up from his drink to find an Apache warrior standing behind him with a knife at his throat. Nobody move, Warhawk said as he stepped into the main room. We're here to talk. The effect was electric. Some of the townspeople dove for cover, while others sat frozen in place. Garrett and his men reached for their weapons, but found themselves facing opponents who had already had them covered. You're making a mistake, Jake said, voice shaking. These men are killers. They'll execute everyone in this room. Warhawk looked at Blake with contempt. We are not the ones who execute children, white man. Standing Bear entered the saloon then, leaning on the crutch Jake had carved for him. His presence seemed to calm some of the townspeople who recognized him from his trading visit. I am Standing Bear, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. Some of you know me. I have traded honestly in this town many years. I have never raised a weapon against any of you. He gestured to Blake. This man paid killers to destroy my family's home, to end the lives of 15 families who had committed no crime except living on land that contained. One of the miners, an older man with gray in his beard, spoke up. Standing Bear has always been fair with us. If he says Blake did this, he's lying, Blake shouted. They're all savages. They attacked my men first. Warhawk stepped forward, and Jake could see the warrior struggling to control his anger. Would you like to see the place where 15 families died? Would you like to see the children's toys scattered in the dirt, the burned homes, the poisoned water? Jake seized the moment. That's exactly what anyone here who wants to ride out with. See for yourself what happened. Blake realized he was losing control of the situation. He nodded to his security men, who began reaching for their weapon. But Garrett, surprisingly, held up a hand to stop them. Blake, I signed on to fight Apache warriors, not to cover up the elimination of families, Garrett. If what they're saying is true, it's every word of it. Garrett looked around the room, seeing the faces of the townspeople, seeing Standing Bear's dignity and Warhawk's controlled fury. Blake, did you tell us these people had attacked miners? Blake's silence was answer enough, because if you lied to us, if you had us target families instead of warriors, Garrett's voice grew hard. That's not what professionals do, Blake. That's what monsters. The confrontation might have turned violent then, but Standing Bear, there has been enough death, old man said. What matters now is stopping more death. He looked directly at Blake. You will end your campaign against my people. You will find other places to dig for your cow, and you will make payment to families of those. Blake laughed. You're in no position to make demands, old. This town depends on my mind. These people won't turn against me for a bunch of savages. The wrong thing. Jake could see the faces of the townspeople changing as Blake's masked ability slipped away completely. One of the miners stood up. Standing Bear saved my boy from drowning in the creek 2 summers back. Risked his own life to pull him out of the current. He looked at Blake with disgust. You're the savage here. Others began speaking up, sharing their own experiences with Standing Bear and his people. Stories of fair trades, help offered during harsh winters, of Apache families who had been neighbors rather than enemies. Blake found himself increasingly isolated as even his own security men began to back away from him. This is insane, Blake said desperately. You're all turning against your own kind for a bunch of Indians. Warhawk stepped closer to Blake, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Your own kind are people who show honor, who protect the innocent, who keep their word. This man shares nothing with you except the color of his skin. Jake found himself nodding in agreement. In the past few days, he'd learned more about honor and courage from Standing Bear and Warhawk than he'd seen from most white men in years. Garrett made his decision. Blake, you're fired. Me and my boys want no part of this, he looked at. As far as I'm concerned, this was all a misunderstanding. We were told we were going after hostile warriors, not family. And the settlement you were planning to attack tomorrow? Warhawk Consider it safe, Garrett said. Blake made one last desperate. You're all making a terrible mistake. When word of this gets out, when people hear that Silver City sided with savages against a legitimate business, then they'll hear that Silver City sided with what's right, the older miners. And if they don't like it, they can take their business elsewhere. A chorus of agreement rose from the other townspeople. Jake realized he was witnessing something remarkable, a moment when people chose to stand for justice rather than comfort. Blake seemed to realize he had lost completely. His shoulders sagged as a fight went out of him. What do you want? He asked quietly, standing bare. And first, you will cease all operations against Apache settlements. Second, you will provide compensation to the families of those who died. Third, you will publicly acknowledge what really happened so that the truth is known. Warhawk smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then, my 200 warriors and I will discuss alternative arrangements with. I'll need time to arrange the compensation. You have 1 week, Warhawk. After that, we will assume you have chosen the alternative arrangement. As the tension in the saloon finally began to ease, Jake found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. A few days ago, he'd been a drifter with no particular purpose, heading toward another temporary job. Now he was part of something larger, something that mattered. Standing Bear approached him as the crowd began to You have done well, Jake. Your grandfather be proud. We all did well, Jake replied, though I have to admit, for a while there, I thought we were all going to end up in a very unpleasant situation. Warhawk overheard and nodded grimly. The situation was indeed dangerous, but sometimes danger is the price of doing what is right. As they prepared to leave Silver City, Jake realized he faced a decision. He could continue his drifting life, or he could find a new purpose working to build understanding between the Apache and the white settler. Standing Bear seemed to read his thought. There is always room for one more voice of reason. The path is not easy, but it is important. Jake looked at the crutch he'd carved, still supporting the old man's weight. A simple thing, a piece of wood shaped by human hands, but it had become the foundation for something much larger, a bridge between two peoples who had forgotten how to trust each other. I reckon I could stick around for a while. Make sure Blake keeps his word, help with the negotiations. Might be I can do some good here. Warhawk his shoulder. You have already done more good than many men accomplish in a lifetime. As dawn broke over Silver City the next morning, Jake stood with Standing Bear and Warhawk on the hill overlooking the town. The crisis had passed, but Jake knew the real work beginning. Building trust between peoples who had been at war for decades would take time, patience, and the efforts of people on both sides willing to see beyond old hatred. But as he watched Standing Bear take careful steps, the crutch he had carved, Jake realized that sometimes the most important changes began with the smallest acts of kindness. A piece of oak shaped with care and given freely had somehow helped save dozens of lives and opened a door to peace that many had thought permanently closed. Warhawk was already planning his return to the Apache territories, where he would carry word of what had happened in Silver City. The story would spread among his people that not all white men were enemies, that some could be trusted to stand for what was right. Similarly, the miners and townspeople would carry their own version of the story, telling how Apache leaders had chosen negotiation over warfare, how they had sought justice rather than revenge. You know, Jake said as they prepared to part ways, I never did get that job at the mine. Standing Bear chuckled. Jake nodded, thinking about the challenges ahead. There would be other conflicts, other misunderstandings, other men like Blake who saw profit in hatred and division, but there would also be people willing to stand up for what was right, willing to bridge the gaps between different worlds. As he mounted his horse for the ride back to the Apache territories, where he would help with the ongoing negotiations, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few days. He was no longer a drifter without purpose, but a man with important work to do. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the night's. Somewhere in the distance, 200 Apache warriors were making their own journey home, carrying news that would spread hope through their villages. In Silver City, miners were beginning another day's work, but now they would do so with a different understanding of their neighbors. And in the New Mexico territory, as the September heat began to build, the foundation for a lasting peace had been laid with nothing more complicated than one man's willingness to carve a crutch for another man who needed help walking. Standing, Bear adjusted his grip on the carefully carved piece of oak that had started it. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the thunder speaks most clearly in the silence." Jake understood. The real victory hadn't been in the confrontation at the saloon, or in Warhawk's show of force, or even in Blake's capitulation. It had been in that quiet moment when a white drifter had seen an injured Apache and decided to help. Everything had grown from a single. As they rode toward the horizon, the three men, representatives of different worlds, carried with them the knowledge that peace was possible when people chose to see each other as individuals rather than enemies. The crutch that Jake had carved would support Standing Bear for years to come, but more importantly, the trust that had grown from that simple act of kindness would support a new understanding between their people. Behind them, Silver City continued its daily business, but it was a changed. Word was already spreading about what had really happened to the Apache families, how the crisis resolved through talking rather than fighting. Other towns would hear the story, and other people would have to decide whether they wanted to follow Silver City's example or continue down the path of hatred and violence. Jake Morrison, who had started the week as a purposeless drifter, now rode with a sense of mission that he'd never felt before. The work ahead would be difficult and sometimes dangerous, but it was work that mattered, and it had all begun with the simple decision to help a stranger in need. As the sun reached its zenith, the three riders crested a hill and looked back one last time at Silver City. Then they turned toward the future, toward the hard but hopeful work of building bridges where walls had stood for far too long. The thunder had indeed spoken most clearly in the silence.